Hey everybody, welcome back. It's the Daily Beef again in week two. I'm really excited for this. It's going to be another great week of talking with Adam Pfeiffer and myself. Been a great week last week, but week two I can't get into it. I can't wait to get into it rather. So this week, real quick before we hop in, this Daily Beef is presented by Rosters.com. Be sure to head over there. If you use the promo code CURVE, you get an instant $20 bonus. So that's not a slow drip. So be sure to use that. It's a great way to try a new site. So with that being said, Adam, let's dive right into it. Week two, this Daily Beef, we're going to be talking about quarterbacks. As you can see to our side here, we're going to talk about our top three quarterbacks, the point spreads. We're going to have a little bit of a segment there to discuss some things we like to look at in DFS. And finally, we're going to talk about our quarterback sleepers. So, Adam, let's get right into it. This week, quarterbacks, top three. What are we thinking?
Yeah, so last week didn't really work out for me very well at quarterback. The Seahawks and Russell Wilson didn't play well. Ty God didn't play well. So I'm looking to bounce back here. I'll start at the top with a relatively easy one. Cam Newton, and we'll talk about this later, but I just see Carolina just. I think the spread is currently 13 right now. Carolina favored by 13 at home. Still, even with that spread, Cam Newton's the one quarterback where even if his team is ahead and blowing a team out, like he's a lock if Carolina scores 28 points in this game to score at least, I think, three of the four touchdowns because the offense runs through him. He's the goal line red zone option. I think he was top 15 in red zone carries last year. Had a red zone or inside the 10 touchdown against Denver. So I'm not ready to anoint the Niners as a good defense. They played the Rams, who were probably going to be a bottom three offense if Monday night was any indication. So I'm perfectly fine with Cam Newton. I think he has a really safe floor here. So I love Cam. He's my top guy despite the high spread. What are your thoughts on Cam?
I'm back and forth on him. I think we'll get into him a little bit in a few minutes, but the one thing about him this week is I was looking at is, like you said, he faces a defense last week that allowed 0 points, but that doesn't matter. That Rams defense and offense, actually, offense was awful. I don't think that is any indication of what we're going to see this year from that Niners defense the whole season. And Cam Newton's a little bit different than the Rams quarterback to have, especially in Case Keenum. So he's a guy this week that I think will be in play, but with how that game script could go, I'm not exactly sure I would love him. So I think we'll talk about that later, but I'm not exactly 100% sold on Cam. My number one guy this week, and you know me, Adam, I'm a guy that loves to eat the chalk, unfortunately. But in cash games, I love Eli Manning this week. I mean, I think everybody's going to be on him, but for me in cash games, it's definitely safe to use because of that matchup. The New Orleans Saints last week allowed a ton of yards. Drew Brees threw for 400 yards and they lost. What's that tell you? That means the defense really struggled. I think we're going to see another indication of them struggling again this week with Eli Manning. And the one guy on that defense that can cover, Delvin Breaux, we'll talk about him a lot today, he's out. He's not going to be playing for quite a while, and that means the Saints really just cannot cover anyone. So for me, in this game flow, I think Eli's going to be the guy. The one thing that I want to mention about him before we go back and forth is last year at home, Eli averaged 300 yards and 2 touchdowns per game, an average of close to 22 fantasy points, and that's a little bit higher than he was on the road. Considering last week he threw 3 touchdowns at a slow game pace, he gets that bump, he gets that home bump, and this defense, I just don't think you can go wrong with Eli this week.
Yeah, I'm not going to argue at all with you on Eli. He has the best matchup in fantasy. And even if Victor Cruz is 80% of what he once was, that just makes this offense 10 times as dangerous as it would have been without him. I don't see any way they stop the passing offense. And I think Mike Clay late last night tweeted pretty interesting nugget that all of the Saints' top 3 corners for Sunday, none of them even started last year for them. So Odell Beckham and company are going to just absolutely destroy them. And obviously, if that happens, Eli's going to have a good game. For me, my second guy, I really like Blake Bortles this week. I like this, as you'll see in my writing throughout the week here at RotoCurve. I'm really into this San Diego-Jacksonville game. I think it's a 48 total or so around that right now. Bortles was fine against Green Bay. That's one of the better secondaries in the league. But I think he's in a great spot here. San Diego gave up 5 red zone attempts last week. That was the most in the league, next to the Chiefs, who they played. So they gave up an 80% conversion rate. So Bortles, who was top 5 in red zone attempts last season, we know that they don't run the football in the end zone very, very effectively. They were bottom 3 in that regard last year. Yeldon did score last week, but it was terrible otherwise. I think he had like 20 carries for 30 yards. So I think even against a bad run defense, I think Bortles is going to have a very nice game against a very exploitable secondary. They already have allowed 5 20-yard passing plays this season, which it's only 1 week, but that's second in the league. And Bortles also, I think he was tied with Carson Palmer in 20-yard passing plays last year. So with Allen Robinson, Allen Hurns, who we'll get into later, I think Bortles has really, really high upside this week, and I loved in tournaments stacking him with these Jacksonville receivers.
Yeah, we talked about Bortles last week. He was one of the guys that I mentioned because he really succeeds in the second half. So I think that definitely has some merit there. I know we definitely we both love this offense this week. So a guy like Bortles, he's going to get all those passing attempts. I can't fault that. But my second guy this week is actually Matt Ryan. I know we talked about him last week. You said he hasn't thrown a red zone touchdown since Nam, and that was basically true. But last week he did. I don't know how it happened, but he was able to connect in the red zone, and that's one of the reasons why I like him this week, because he definitely has a chance to succeed in the red zone and out of the red zone against the Raiders, who were just absolutely torched by the Saints last week. Drew Brees had 400 yards and 4 touchdowns. And the one thing about this Raiders secondary, they have some guys that can play in zone. David Amerson, Sean Smith, DJ Hayden was his own corner in college, but you can't really beat Julio with zone. You're gonna have to put some guys on him in man coverage. If Amerson ends up on Julio Jones in man coverage, that's gonna be a long day for that cornerback. He struggled in zone a ton in college. I believe Sammy Watkins beat him 3 or 4 times in one game. DeAndre Hopkins beat him. So if he's in man coverage, that's going to be a really tough thing for him to be able to succeed against Julio. And if Julio has a big game, Matt Ryan's going to have a big game. Not to mention on the other side, Mohamed Sanu looked really good last week. Jacob Tamme had a few catches. So there's too many weapons, I think, for Ryan to not succeed against a terrible defense. So for me, he's my number 2 this week.
Yeah, Ryan's a guy I'm probably not going to have a lot of exposure to, honestly, just because I like other guys more. I know it's kind of interesting to say this after him having a nice game last week, but I still don't know what his upside is, especially on the road. I talked about it last week. Coming into last week, he had 1 or fewer touchdown passes in 18 of his last 32 games. So, I don't know. I don't know if I can trust Matt Ryan on the road. I think Oakland will be better in this game on defense. We'll see. His receivers not even 100% right now. I don't hate Matt Ryan. Definitely not a core guy for me at the quarterback position, but I could see. I mean, it has a relatively high total. The Falcons could not run the ball at all last week using a committee approach. Plus, they have 2 talented pass catchers out of the backfield. So I could see it. Probably not where I'm going to go, though, because, again, for the second straight week, I'm on Matthew Stafford as my 3rd guy. Love Matthew Stafford this year. Was a believer in the Jim Bob Cooter effect last season. Against Indianapolis, he didn't have to do much in terms of how, I think his average depth of target was around 5 yards, so he didn't have to do much, but, I still think with all these weapons, the pass-catching backs out of the backfield, and I don't think they're going to be able to run the ball at all compared to what they did last week against Indy. Tennessee has a pretty good front. You saw what they did to Adrian Peterson last week. So I think Stafford and Mariota throw the ball a ton in this game. Game is a 47 total, I believe. Detroit's at home where Stafford plays better. I love Stafford. I just think he's one of my favorite quarterbacks to roster this season because the weapons he has, he's going to throw the ball a lot. And I just think we talked about it on the podcast, I think he's just a more efficient quarterback without having to just have tunnel vision for Calvin Johnson anymore. So, again, I'm on Matthew Stafford in this game, and I will be throughout the season because he probably has the best passing schedule in the NFL.
Yeah, it's a good point. I know we talked about Stafford last week, and I missed on him. I can admit that. Thought that I couldn't trust him yet without Calvin Johnson, and honestly, that was really wrong. He had a lot of fantasy points last week. We saw him pass the ball to the running backs. Golden Tate looked good. Marvin Jones looked good. catching about 4 balls for 87 yards or so. So I think that's it's a trend that you may see a lot more this year in Stafford throwing the ball a lot and connecting efficiently. Now, for this week, this would be the only quarterback I think that I may have a little bit of a beef with you, and that's because the only way I look at Stafford this week is in that price range. He's around there at Carr. Carson Palmer is a little bit cheaper, who I'll talk about in a second. Russell Wilson's even there. But the thing is, if that Tennessee offense has the ball for a long time, and they could with the way they run the ball, Stafford may not see as many snaps. Now, I'm on him more this week than I was last week, as he proved me wrong against a bad defense. So I'm not exactly against Stafford, but if there's anyone I had to pick to kind of be a little bit less than productive compared to the other people at his prices, it probably would be him. But my third guy, I just alluded to it earlier, and that's Carson Palmer. This guy's so cheap, just 6,900 on DraftKings. He's been one of the top finishers at quarterback in the last few years. They throw the ball a ton. If you know anything about Bruce Arians' offense, he loves to attack the ball downfield. He's been a max protect guy, five or six linemen, sometimes using an unbalanced line. Definitely keeps his tight ends and his running backs in to block, and just chucks the ball down the field. So for this week, for me, I really like Palmer because that fits perfectly with the matchup he has against Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay has two good slot corners in Brent Grimes and Alteron Werner, but they're playing on the outside. That doesn't necessarily bode well for their chances against Larry Fitzgerald and Michael Floyd, who are both two monsters of wide receivers. We know about Fitzgerald. Michael Floyd's a big one as well. So the one way that I look at this is Carson Palmer's two targets that he's going to be looking at the most have massive size advantages over their opponents. So for me, that's always something I like to look at, and you know he's going to throw the ball. So just 6,900, I think he's a safe bet for a very impressive week this week, and just 6,900 on DraftKings, I'm way in.
Yeah, I've been talking about Palmer since before the season started. When I first initially looked at the DraftKings pricing, I think it was 6,900 before the season started. I don't get why. He was top 7 or 8 in fantasy points last season among quarterbacks, and he plays for one of the most high-powered offenses in the league. So I don't get why he's 6,900. So I'm probably going to play Carson Palmer until his price goes up. So I'm with you on Palmer for sure.
Yeah, it's really interesting because when you look at a guy like that at his price, you would think, you know what, he can't be priced right. Maybe it's a trap, maybe it's something like that. But we just talked about all the factors why it could be a success. So I don't necessarily.
Palmer at 6'9" and Ryan at 6'8", I'm going Palmer every single time.
Yeah, that's true. So. That's a good point. That's the way I'm going to be debating myself right now. I do like Ryan a little bit more, but in tournaments, I think that it's going to be a way to attack the ownership. So let's move on to the next topic here, point spreads. Now, what we mean by this is we're talking about quarterbacks today. So in point spread games, we're looking at games that potentially can affect how your daily fantasy quarterbacks can succeed or maybe the lack of success. So the one way I like to look at it is for quarterbacks in a spread of maybe 10 points, 13 points, if you think that team is going to crush the opposition, how do you really approach it? For this week, I know Cam Newton's a guy that Adam likes, and that is a big spread. I think that's going to be one of the biggest spreads of the week. Carolina could crush their opposition in San Francisco this week. So, Adam, quarterbacks and big spreads, how do you attack that?
Yeah, for me, it kind of depends on the quarterback and the offense. So, like I talked about, when Carolina has a 13-point spread at home against a bad team, I don't worry about that as much as I would worry about maybe, a Tom Brady or something like that, because it's kind of Brady's a great quarterback, but often that Patriots offense depends on Belichick's game plan. Whereas Carolina, this offense runs through Cam Newton, like I talked about. Like if they score 28 points, I would be shocked if Cam didn't get at least 3 touchdowns of the 4. Maybe their defense could score a touchdown, which is possible because they're going against Blaine Gabbert. But Cam I think, just has the highest floor in fantasy because of his rushing totals. I think he had 8 or 9 rushing attempts in week 1. He's going to run the ball a ton. Like I said, he's going to see multiple goal line rushes in this game because Carolina should have no trouble moving the ball. I'm just not worried about as much with Cam as I would be with other quarterbacks. So in terms of that, I think it really does depend on the quarterback, and this is kind of the ideal quarterback you want in a situation where his team is favored by so much because the floor is so high, and like I said, the offense absolutely runs through Cam Newton, so I'm not as worried about it as I would be with other guys.
I think this is where we defer, Adam. This is where I'm going to have a beef with you because while I do agree, I think it depends on the quarterback. But this week in particular, I think that is why we would go against Cam Newton in a high-scoring game, simply because the way that this offense runs, like you said, is through the running game, through Cam Newton when they're up or when they're tied, or maybe it's a close game. But considering Cam got banged up a lot last week, I think we saw 3 or 4 hits to the head, whether it be from a shoulder pad or another helmet, which wasn't flagged, but that's a story for another day. But I'm thinking if they get up big in this game, they don't want to risk their number one weapon, a guy that is arguably one of the best offensive players in football. So I can see them being up by a couple touchdowns and thinking, you know what, let's just hand the ball off. Let's use Stewart. Let's use Tolbert. And maybe if they get up by a huge margin, they could bring in the backup quarterback. Now, the one thing I did see, and I'll give you credit for this because it's a really interesting stat. I'm not 100% sure if it's correct, but I saw somewhere that Cam Newton has averaged over 31 fantasy points per game in games with a spread of 7 or higher. If so, that's impressive, and it's hard to argue against that. But for me, I think every game has to be looked at in a vacuum. And considering that Cam has been banged up last week, I don't know if they want to take a risk against a bad team in San Francisco. So if they get up big, I'm not sure he's going to be accumulating fantasy points. And for me, at that price, I'm just not sure I can use him.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I just think if they do get up big, it's going to be because of Cam. Like I do like Stewart in this game as well, but I just think Cam, with what he does in this offense, with Kelvin Benjamin back looking good, with Greg Olsen healthy, just has such a high floor that, like I said, well, Carolina probably has one of the highest team totals of the week. So if they, like I said, if they score 28 points in this game on offense, I would be absolutely shocked if at least 3 of those touchdowns were not either with Cam Newton's arm or his legs. Like I would be legitimately shocked.
Yeah, that's true. I think the way that I look at it though is to be the contrarian here is I really don't think that, like you said, if they score 28 touchdowns, we'd be shocked if he doesn't have 3.
28 touchdowns.
It could happen. 28 points, rather. 28 touchdowns could happen, but maybe against the Rams on pick sixes. So, but yeah, the one way I look at it, if they score 28 points and say 2 of those touchdowns come, maybe one's from the defense and the other one's from Jonathan Stewart, I think we're looking at a very limited ceiling for Newton. And while I do agree his floor is high, his ceiling for me is just not going to cut it this week.
All right, we'll see.
Might have to make a little bit of a side bet there.
Yeah, we could do that. I think we could do that.
Yeah, now one more thing I wanted to touch on in this point spreads real quick is I know we talked about Russell Wilson last week with this topic. And just real quick, I want to hear your thoughts. That was supposed to be a big spread. The Seahawks were supposed to win by a lot. Russell Wilson threw over 40 times but still didn't succeed. Does that play any merit into this week, or are you just kind of looking at that as an anomaly?
I mean, that was Wilson's most attempts in a game in his career. I think it was 43. So that was just a weird game. Seattle looked terrible on offense. Their offensive line got pushed around by Miami's defensive line. This game, I think, has like a 39 total. I don't really want to touch Russell Wilson, especially with the ankle injury. He's probably going to play through it, but I'm not into Russell Wilson this week, which means I'm never on him when he plays against the Rams because the Rams usually play Seattle so well, which means Wilson throws the ball more, and he has like 350 and 3 with like 2 picks, but it's still a good fantasy game. So he's probably going to go off since I'm not on him.
Yeah, just how it works sometimes, right?
Yeah.
All right. Now, I think we should move on to our next topic here, the last one we have on the beef for quarterbacks, and that's quarterback sleepers. I know last week everybody talked about Dak Prescott as a sleeper. I know, Adam, you mentioned Carson Wentz as a sleeper, and that's a great call there, 272 touchdowns at basically the same price as Wentz. So for this week, Adam, who's your quarterback at sleeper? Is there anybody that you're really targeting there?
Yeah, that's a guy I've been targeting in the entire offseason. We'll do so as long as his price is this low. Marcus Mariota, he's only 6K on DraftKings. Didn't have the greatest real-life game, but still threw for, I think, 270 and 2 touchdowns against a top 3 or 4 defense in the Vikings. It wasn't a perfect game. He had a pick 6. He had a fumble, lost that scoop and scored. But with Mariota, for me, and it has been like this entire offseason, it all comes down to the rushing. You look at last year, in his rookie year, 87-yard touchdown run clearly showed the athleticism and big playability, yet he only had 17 designed runs. When Malarkey took over, though, he started to run the ball more. In the offseason, Malarkey said they were going to use him in that regard more. And he had 4 attempts in week 1. I think 2 of them were designed. But I think this is a trend we're going to continue to see with the Titans. Plus, I don't think they're going to be able to actually run the ball between the tackles very effectively in this game. They're, you know, Detroit's a home favorite. We saw what Detroit's defense let Andrew Luck do in Week 1, and particularly the tight end position with Jack Doyle scoring 2 touchdowns. Eric Ebron scored, Dwayne Allen scored a touchdown. So I think Delaney Walker, if he could have a big game, and he's in a good spot, Mariota should have a really solid game too. And at that price range, I really like him. The Colts went 4 for 4 in the red zone last week with 4 touchdowns. I love Mariota in general this season. I love his price this week. I like this game a decent amount, 47-point total. I think the Lions will be a little bit ahead and will be able to stop the run enough where Mariota's going to have to throw the ball a good amount. And I like his playmakers this year. They're a lot better than last year. Tajay Sharp is starting to emerge. Delaney Walker's still there. So, yeah, I really like Mariota at that price.
It's a good point you make about having a guy that could be a receiver that could have a big day, and Delaney Walker. Somebody has to throw him the ball, and that's a good way to look at the quarterbacks. Like you said, last week, Mariota had 18.7 DraftKings points, same scoring on rosters. He had a little bit less on FanDuel. But the way you look at it is this week at 6,000, you're looking at 3x, and that's decent salary returns for cash games especially. And that was against the Vikings. This Detroit Lions defense is not the Minnesota Vikings. I'm sure we can say that. And one thing about running quarterbacks is they do have a relatively higher floor. Because if you can get 20 or 30 yards rushing, that's as close to an extra touchdown, passing touchdown being 4 points, as you can get. So I don't think that's something you should overlook. Now, for me, my sleeper at quarterback this week is another guy that can run the ball, Dak Prescott. I know last week he let a lot of people down. But the way you have to look at it is a little bit different than just the overall, result. He had a touchdown dropped, Cole Beasley, I believe, and he also had a touchdown called back from Des Bryant, who just for some reason can't seem to catch the ball in terms of the NFL rules. I don't know what it is about that guy, but that's 2 touchdowns right there. Now, I know coulda, woulda, shoulda. It's an if game. That's how it all works. But he was that close. It's not like he missed throws, or it's not like they got anywhere close to the end zone. So for me, I think this week is a good week to look at him. A little bit of a less ownership because a lot of people will be off him considering the letdown last week. But he has that matchup against the Redskins, who were just absolutely torched by the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Steelers ran all over them. The Steelers passed all over them. Rashad Breeland looked like an awful, awful cornerback, but hey, Antonio Brown's going to do that to anyone, right? So this week I like Prescott against a pretty bad defense, at least what we saw in Week 1 in the Washington Redskins. His price is still low. It's not like it jumped up to the mid-6s or almost close to 7,000. I still believe he's 5,800 or something like that on DraftKings. So he is relatively cheap. He has that great matchup against the Redskins, and I think he qualifies as a sleeper this week because anytime with an underwhelming performance, the ownership always drops for me, and I think that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, especially now that he's not minimum salary, he's up to 5.8 on DraftKings. So between that and the fact that he didn't really deliver last week, interesting tournament play. The only knock I have on him is what's his upside really. He only averaged just over 5 yards per attempt. To put that into perspective, the league average last year was just over 7. So against Washington, I think this could be a major Zeke game if you saw what DeAngelo Williams did against Washington on Monday night. But he is going to be low owned compared, drastically lower owned compared to what he was last week. Washington, we'll see what they do with Josh Norman and company. But I don't mind him. I don't love him, I guess, is the way I would look at Dak.
Yeah, just to add a couple more names there in that price range, we talked about pivots last week off of Prescott because of the ownership percentage. If by some chance he does end up being highly owned again, Jay Cutler's cheaper, Carson Wentz is cheaper. So there are guys there at that price range that do have a little bit of upside. I know Cutler is one of those guys that is either boom or bust, but he does face the Eagles. We have a good front seven, 2 good safeties, but those cornerbacks definitely leave a lot to be desired. So that's definitely a way to look at it. We touched on a lot of quarterbacks today, Adam. It was a lot of fun to talk about. The signal callers going to be the focal points of a lot of cash game lineups. You can't get your quarterback wrong, especially. We saw that in cash games last week. For those of you that
I got Prescott. My quarterback wrong.
There you go. With Tyrod, yeah. So you get your cash game quarterback wrong. Sometimes it doesn't work out. So you're going to want to nail those quarterbacks. Be sure to go back and touch up on what we just discussed. I know Adam likes Bortles, he likes Cam Newton. I like Matt Ryan as well, and I think that the top quarterback this week in terms of ownership percentage and quite possibly fantasy points is Eli Manning. So basically, we want to wrap this up real quick by once again thanking Rosters.com for an excellent sponsorship of the Daily Beef. As you can see right down there, you can use promo code CURVE and get an instant $20 bonus. After depositing $10, you can get $30. You can play their $25 GPP, $5 GPP, maybe some cash games. You can now win some money over there. So that basically wraps up the Daily Beef at quarterbacks. I'm Josh Kalachi. That's Adam Pfeiffer. Good night, everyone. Good luck, and let's win some money this week.